All right, guys, this is a tough one to talk about, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. I'm sharing this because honestly, if it happened to me, it could happen to any of us. And trust me, it didn't unfold the way you might think. This isn't your typical, I found text on her phone story. Jessica and I had been married for 8 years. We were that couple everyone thought had it all figured out. No major arguments, no big issues. I worked long hours, yeah, but that was part of the deal. We had goals, plans for the future. I thought we were on the same page, both working toward that comfortable life together. Everything seemed normal until one random Thursday night. We had this usual routine: dinner, a little TV, and then she'd spend an hour or so in her studio painting before bed. She's always been into art. It was her thing, her escape from the daily grind. So, when she started an online art class a few months ago, I didn't think anything of it. I was glad she had something she enjoyed. Now, here's where things started to get weird. One evening, I came home from work a little earlier than usual. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I figured she was in her studio, so I wandered in to say hi. That's when I noticed something odd. Her easel was empty, no paints out, no brushes, nothing. The place was clean, like it hadn't been touched in weeks. I chalked it up to her cleaning up earlier or something, but it nagged at me. Later that night, I casually asked her how the art class was going. She just smiled, said it was great, and started talking about the new techniques she was learning. But that empty easel kept bothering me. Why would she lie about painting? A couple of days later, I decided to check the class schedule, just out of curiosity. That's when I found out the class she had signed up for. It had ended 3 weeks ago. Now I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? The next morning, she left for her usual Saturday art class session. I was suspicious now, so I decided to do something I've never done before. I followed her. I felt ridiculous, like some kind of paranoid teenager, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I expected her to drive to the local art studio, but instead, she drove clear across town to a completely different neighborhood. She parked in front of this upscale apartment building. My heart was pounding. I waited in the car, watching her walk up to the door and buzz herself in. She was smiling, looking relaxed, like she was going to meet someone she was excited to see. I waited for about 15 minutes, debating with myself. Then I did something I never imagined I'd do. I got out of the car, walked up to the building, and pretended I was there to see someone. When the door buzzed open behind me, I slipped inside. I checked the directory by the door. No names I recognized. But I had a gut feeling, so I took the stairs and quietly started checking the floors. On the third floor, I heard her laugh. That familiar sound, but muffled behind a door. My hands were shaking. I couldn't believe what I was about to do. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear more. There was music playing, voices, and then I heard a man's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. I was standing there in a strange building listening to my wife laugh with some guy, and my stomach was in knots. I had two options: knock on that door and confront her, or walk away. But the truth is, I needed to know more. I needed proof. So I left as quietly as I came. That night, I didn't say anything. I just sat there, letting it sink in. This wasn't some affair I stumbled on through texts or social media. She was leading a whole other life when I thought she was painting in her studio. And it gets worse, because when I started digging, I found out the man in that apartment. He wasn't the only one. Stay with me, because what came next blew the lid off everything I thought I knew about my wife and our marriage. So, after hearing my wife laughing behind that door, I was in shock. But I knew I couldn't just barge in. I needed to be smart about this. And honestly, I needed proof, something solid, not just a gut feeling or a hunch. I went back home and sat there in silence, thinking about everything that had just happened. I couldn't believe it. 8 years of marriage, and I had no clue she was capable of this. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. The next few days were rough. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed time to gather my thoughts, figure out how I was going to approach this. But I also needed to know more. That apartment wasn't the end of the story, and I knew it. Here's where it gets even more twisted. I started paying closer attention to her routine. She still left the house a few times a week for her so-called art classes. But now I was tracking every move. I wasn't just sitting back hoping for more signs. I put a GPS tracker on her car, yes, I went there. I know some of you might be thinking it's extreme, but when you're in this deep, you do what you have to do to get to the truth. A couple of days later, I'm sitting at work, watching the GPS updates on my phone. I see she's not headed to the art studio, no surprise there. She's driving downtown again, but this time it's not to the same apartment building. She pulls into a parking lot at a high-end hotel. A hotel? I couldn't believe it. I waited a bit, then made my way there, parking a block away. I walked into the lobby, keeping my distance. I wasn't going to blow my cover just yet. I watched from a corner as she walked in, dressed up like she was meeting someone important. Not the same casual art class look she left the house with. She walked straight through the lobby to the elevator without even looking around, like this was routine for her. That's when I realized this wasn't just one guy. The apartment visit, the hotel meet-up, these weren't isolated incidents. She was living an entirely different life right under my nose. I sat in my car for over an hour, trying to wrap my head around it. This wasn't a fling, this was a pattern. And the worst part? She was good at hiding it. I'd been in the dark for who knows how long. But here's where things took a turn I didn't see coming. That night, she came home and acted like nothing was different, like we were the same couple we'd always been. She asked me about my day, we watched TV, and she went to bed early. But I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. So, I did something that took this whole thing to another level. I waited until she fell asleep. Then I grabbed her phone. I'm not proud of this, but I knew her passcode. I needed answers, and I was done playing it cool. I started scrolling through her texts, her emails, anything I could find. And that's when I saw it. She wasn't just meeting one guy. She had a whole roster. There were messages from multiple men. Each one had their own nickname for her, their own inside jokes, their own plans to meet up. I felt sick. This wasn't just an affair, it was a full-blown secret life. But it got even worse when I started digging deeper into the conversations. This wasn't just about hooking up. These guys were sending her money, thousands of dollars. I saw messages about her needing help with hospital bills or paying off debt. She had spun these elaborate stories about being in financial trouble, and these guys were just handing over their cash. She was playing them all. At this point, I was furious. I wasn't just betrayed as a husband, I was being used as the cover for her scams. Our life, our marriage, everything we'd built was just a front for her lies. That's when I knew I had to play this smart. If I confronted her too soon, she'd lie, twist the story, make me look like the bad guy. I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. I decided it was time to collect evidence and build a case against her. Trust me, guys, what I found out next made everything before this look like child's play. You won't believe how far she went and what I did to turn the tables on her. All right, guys, if you're still with me, brace yourselves. Because as bad as things had gotten up until this point, what came next really sent me over the edge. I thought I had a handle on things. I had the evidence, I knew she was cheating, and I knew she was scamming these guys for money. But it turns out I didn't even know the half of it. After discovering the money transfers and the multiple men she was seeing, I knew I couldn't confront her without a solid plan. I needed to dig deeper, figure out just how far this went. So, I started doing some research on the names of the men she was talking to. A couple of them had pretty unique names, so I hit up social media, LinkedIn, whatever I could find. And let me tell you, what I uncovered was worse than anything I could have imagined. Turns out, these men weren't random. They weren't just guys she met online or through some dating app. She had targeted them. These were wealthy, successful men, doctors, businessmen, even a well-known politician. Each one of them had been completely duped by my wife's stories. They thought they were saving her from some financial crisis or helping her out of debt, but in reality, she was just funneling their money into her own pockets. I couldn't believe it. Here I was busting my ass working long hours to provide for us, and she was out conning rich guys for cash on the side. It wasn't just infidelity anymore. It was full-blown fraud. So I kept digging. I wanted to know how she was pulling this off. That's when I found out she had fake social media accounts, multiple email addresses, and even a second phone number I didn't know about. She had created an entire persona. Multiple personas depending on who she was talking to. She was playing them all, weaving these sob stories about her health, her family, her finances. But here's where it really took a turn. I discovered she wasn't just conning these guys for money. She had been blackmailing one of them, a married man. She had convinced him that if he didn't pay up, She'd expose their affair to his wife and ruin his life. This wasn't just a scam anymore. It was a criminal operation. I couldn't believe the person I was married to could do something like this. The woman I thought I knew, kind, supportive, loyal, had become someone I didn't recognize. She was dangerous, and I knew I couldn't just sit back and let her continue. I realized confronting her directly wasn't enough anymore. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation where we split ways. No, I needed to dismantle the whole thing, piece by piece, and make sure she paid for every single lie she had told. Here's where my plan for revenge started to take shape. First, I needed more evidence. I wasn't going to risk confronting her too soon and letting her spin her way out of it. I went through our bank accounts, credit card statements, everything. I took screenshots of all the conversations I found with the other men, every transaction she had received. I even hired a private investigator to help me gather more information about her activities outside the house. Over the next few weeks, I quietly collected every piece of dirt I could find. I set up hidden cameras around the house. Nothing obvious, just enough to record her phone calls and video chats when I wasn't home. I caught her talking to these men, laughing about how she had fooled them, making plans to meet up and continue the charade. At this point, I had everything I needed. I had the proof, the recordings, the money trail. I could have gone to the police right then and there, but I wasn't ready to pull the trigger just yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done first. So, I started phase 2 of my plan. Remember how I told you one of the guys was a politician? Well, I decided to reach out to him. Not to blackmail him. No, I wasn't sinking to her level. But I wanted him to know what was going on, to see the full picture of what my wife had been up to. I sent him an anonymous tip with some of the evidence I had gathered. I didn't expect much to come of it, but a few days later, I got a response. He wanted to meet. This guy was terrified. I could tell he had no idea how deep he was in, and he was desperate to make sure this didn't blow up his career. So, we struck a deal. He would help me take her down. He wasn't the only one on board either. I reached out to a couple of the other men, guys who had sent her money, thinking they were helping someone in need. Once they saw the evidence, they were all in. Together, we hatched a plan. We would set a trap for her, but it had to be perfect. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to ruin her life, the way she had ruined mine. Now that I had the cooperation of a few of the men Jessica had been scamming, it was time to dive deeper. This wasn't just about confronting her. It was about exposing her for who she truly was. I wasn't just going to let her get away with cheating. I was going to dismantle everything she had built behind my back piece by piece. And believe me, it wasn't easy holding back. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to tell her I knew everything. But I couldn't afford to let emotions get the better of me. I needed to be smart. At home, I kept things normal. She still had no clue what I was up to. I acted like the same husband I'd always been, coming home from work, chatting about our days, pretending not to notice her slipping out for her art classes or late-night meetings with friends, all while quietly gathering every bit of evidence I could get my hands on. The first thing I did was start digging into our finances. I pulled up bank records, credit card statements, and anything else I could access. And sure enough, I found what I was looking for. Money disappearing into accounts I didn't recognize. It wasn't much at first, but then I found a pattern. Small, regular withdrawals into a separate bank account that she had opened under a fake name. She was funneling cash into it, slowly and steadily, all while spinning lies to these men about needing help with medical bills, debt, and other made-up crises. And then there was the second phone. You see, she had a whole separate phone number I didn't know about. With the help of the private investigator I hired, I tracked down the exact phone she was using. A burner phone she kept hidden in her car, tucked away like she didn't expect anyone to find it. But I did. When I went through that phone, it was like opening Pandora's box. There were texts, voicemails, and pictures from the men she was stringing along. Each one thought they were special, that they were the one helping her out of some tough situation. I'll never forget reading one message where a guy mentioned sending her almost $10,000 to help her get back on her feet. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here thinking, what feet? We had no debts, no medical emergencies, nothing. But it wasn't just about the money. Jessica had built emotional ties with these men. She was playing each one like a violin. She was the damsel in distress for one, a wild, free spirit for another. And for one guy, she had even convinced him that she was in the middle of leaving me, just waiting for the right moment to walk out and start a new life with him. That hit me hard. It was like a punch in the gut all over again. But instead of letting it break me, I used it. I kept adding it to my growing mountain of evidence. The texts, the calls, the financial trail, the fake accounts. By now, I had enough to blow her entire operation wide open. But I wasn't done. One of the men she had been conning was a married man, just like me. This guy was in deep, and Jessica had been blackmailing him for months. He had paid her off multiple times to keep quiet about their affair, terrified that she'd expose him and ruin his family. And once I started connecting the dots, I realized she wasn't just extorting him. There were others. She had built this little empire of control, using fear and manipulation to squeeze money out of these guys, all while hiding it under the guise of our marriage. With all of this in hand, I decided it was time to act. I couldn't sit back any longer. But I wasn't going to confront her alone. That's where the real twist came in. I started reaching out to the men, one by one. I contacted the married man who had been paying her off and showed him the evidence I had gathered. He flipped. He was terrified that his wife would find out, but he also wanted to take her down. And the more I dug, the more men I found who were willing to help. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure Jessica couldn't ruin anyone else's life the way she had tried to ruin mine. Together, we came up with a plan. Each of the men would continue playing along, acting as if they were still hooked by her lies. We'd let her think she was in control. But instead of meeting them one-on-one, we'd set a trap. Each man would tell her they wanted to meet up for a special evening. But instead of keeping the meetings separate, we coordinated everything so they'd all show up at the same place at the same time. And the best part? She'd have no idea what was coming. It took weeks to set up. I had to coordinate everything. Timing, locations, making sure no one tipped her off. But finally, the day came. She thought she was meeting one of her lovers at a fancy downtown restaurant. What she didn't know was that every man she had been fooling was going to be there, waiting for her. And I was going to be there too, watching it all go down. Now we're getting to the part you've been waiting for. How it all came crashing down for Jessica. After weeks of planning, gathering evidence, and coordinating with the men she had been playing, we were ready to put the final nail in the coffin. I was done sitting in the background, watching her manipulate and lie her way through life. It was time for her to face the consequences. So here's how we set it up. Each of the men Jessica had been seeing thought they were going to meet her for a romantic evening. She'd already arranged to meet one of them, but what she didn't know was that every single man she had conned was in on the plan. The idea was simple. She'd walk into the restaurant expecting to see one of her lovers, but instead, she'd find every single one of them sitting there, waiting for her together. We chose a high-end restaurant downtown, the kind of place where she'd least expect a confrontation. The men involved agreed to act like everything was normal leading up to the meeting. They sent their usual flirty texts, made it seem like they couldn't wait to see her. Jessica thought she was going to have a cozy dinner with one of them, and maybe a little more afterward. Little did she know, she was walking into an ambush. The night finally came. I arrived at the restaurant early, slipping in before the men got there, so I could watch the whole thing from a corner booth. The manager was in on it too. One of the guys Jessica had scammed was a regular at the place, so he arranged for us to have a private section of the restaurant for the big reveal. As I sat there waiting, I had a mix of emotions running through me. Part of me was still angry at how she had betrayed me, how she had lied to my face for so long. But another part of me felt strange, like I was about to finally close a chapter that had been haunting me for months. I'd been building up to this moment, and now it was time to watch it all come crashing down. The men started arriving one by one, each of them in on the plan, but pretending they were there for their own private date. They sat down together, introduced themselves, and waited for Jessica. I could see the tension in the air. Most of them had never met before, but they all shared the same goal. They wanted to see the look on her face when she realized her game was over. Then about 15 minutes later, she walked in. Jessica looked confident, smiling as she strolled into the restaurant. She was dressed up, clearly expecting a romantic evening. I could see the way she glanced around the place, looking for the man she thought she was meeting. But as she approached the table, her expression changed. She froze. Sitting there, at the table, were all the men she had been stringing along, each of them staring back at her, waiting for her reaction. And let me tell you, the look on her face was priceless. It was like watching someone's world collapse in real time. Her smile vanished, replaced by confusion, then panic, and finally, a dawning realization of what was happening. For a moment, she just stood there speechless. She didn't know what to do. She looked around, as if trying to find an escape route, but there wasn't one. She was trapped. One of the men, let's call him Steve, was the first to speak. He calmly stood up, pulled out a stack of printed screenshots of their text conversations, and laid them out on the table in front of her. "We know everything," he said. "Every lie. Every dollar you scammed out of us. It's over." Jessica's face went pale. She tried to stammer out an excuse, saying it was all a misunderstanding that she could explain. But no one was buying it. Another guy, Mark, chimed in. "You told me you were leaving your husband. You've been lying to all of us. We're done." By this point, she was visibly shaking. She looked over at the manager, probably thinking she could cause a scene and get out of it. But the manager just stood there, arms crossed, letting it play out. No one was coming to her rescue. Finally, I stood up from my booth and walked over to the table. The moment she saw me, I could see the shock hit her all over again. She hadn't expected me to be there. I looked her in the eye, and in the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "This ends now." I laid out the evidence I had, copies of the bank transfers, the texts, the burner phone logs, everything. I told her I had enough to press charges, not just for the cheating, but for fraud, blackmail, and identity theft. She had been using fake names and accounts to cover her tracks, and now it was all in front of her. Jessica tried to defend herself, of course. She rambled about how she was going through a tough time, how she didn't mean to hurt anyone, how she was just trying to get by. But no one at that table was having it. Every man there had been lied to, manipulated, and cheated. And now she was caught with nowhere to run. Then came the final blow. I pulled out a pre-drafted separation agreement. I told her she could sign it right then and there, or I'd take everything to the authorities and her life would come crashing down even harder. Either way, our marriage was over. She sat down, shaking, barely able to hold the pen as she signed the document. The men she had conned stood up one by one and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her alone at the table. The look on her face, defeated, humiliated, and trapped, was exactly what I'd been waiting for. And just like that, it was done. But the story doesn't end there. What came after, the aftermath of all this, is just as important. Stick around, because in the next part, I'll tell you how Jessica's life fell apart after that night, and how I moved forward from the wreckage. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. If you thought the restaurant scene was the end of it, you're wrong. After the confrontation, things really started to unravel for Jessica, and for me, it was like watching a slow-motion car crash. But there's more to this story. You see, when someone like Jessica loses control of their web of lies, they don't just go down without a fight. She wasn't about to let everything fall apart without trying to take me down with her. But spoiler alert, she failed. Miserably. Let me walk you through what happened after the restaurant debacle. So, as I said, I filed for divorce right away. I didn't waste any time. I had everything I needed: the separation agreement, the proof of her affairs, and the fraud she had been committing. I was ready to move on, but Jessica? Not so much. At first, she played the victim, which I expected. She tried to spin the whole situation, telling her family and anyone who would listen that I had driven her to cheat. According to her, I had been a distant, cold husband who pushed her away. She went on and on about how lonely she had been, how hard things were for her, and how she only started seeing other men because she felt neglected. Classic, right? But here's the thing. No one was buying it. Remember how I had already spoken to her family? They knew the truth. And after seeing the evidence I shared, there was no sympathy left for her. Her parents were devastated by what she had done. And her friends? They were done with her too. Jessica was completely isolated, but she wasn't ready to give up. She was angry, and she wanted revenge. Here's where things got interesting. About a week after I filed for divorce, strange things started happening. I began getting anonymous emails. Nothing too threatening at first, just weird messages suggesting I wasn't the nice guy people thought I was. Then my coworkers started receiving strange emails too. The emails claimed I was involved in suspicious financial activities and hinted that I had been embezzling money from my company. I knew immediately where this was coming from, Jessica. She was trying to ruin my reputation, hoping to make me look as bad as she did. I wasn't surprised, honestly. People like her, when backed into a corner, will lash out in any way they can. But here's the thing. I was prepared. I had made sure to cover all my bases before this point. I knew she might try something like this. I had already spoken to my boss and shared some of the background on what was going on in my personal life. I wanted to make sure that if she tried to stir up trouble, no one would take her seriously. Sure enough, after the email started circulating, my boss pulled me into a meeting. He'd received one of the anonymous messages accusing me of stealing from the company, but instead of being concerned, he was amused. He knew the whole story and assured me that he wasn't going to pay any attention to the lies Jessica was trying to spread. But that didn't stop her. She kept escalating. A few days later, I came home from work to find a legal notice on my doorstep. Jessica was trying to sue me. She claimed that I had been hiding assets during our marriage, that I had been the one cheating on her, and that she was entitled to a significant portion of my earnings because of it. I had expected a tough divorce, but this was a whole new level of crazy. Her claims were ridiculous. She had no proof, because obviously none of it was true. But that didn't stop her from dragging me into court, hoping to somehow turn the tables and get back at me for exposing her. I wasn't about to back down, though. I had enough evidence to show that not only was she lying, but that she had been the one committing fraud and manipulating multiple men for financial gain. My lawyer was a shark, and we were ready for anything she tried to throw at us. The court battle dragged on for months. Every time I thought we were nearing the end, Jessica would come up with some new lie, some new tactic to stall the process. She accused me of everything under the sun: financial abuse, emotional neglect, even trying to sabotage her professional life. Of course, none of it stuck. We had the evidence, and every time she made a claim, we shut it down with hard facts. But Jessica wasn't done. During the trial, she decided to make one last desperate move. She went to the media. I couldn't believe it when I saw the article pop up online. An interview with Jessica where she painted herself as the innocent wife who had been wronged by her cold, controlling husband. She played the part of the victim beautifully, claiming that I had destroyed her life, and that she was struggling to rebuild after the abuse she had suffered. I was furious. I knew what she was trying to do. She was hoping that by getting public sympathy, she could turn the court of public opinion against me, maybe even pressure me into a settlement to avoid further embarrassment. But she underestimated me. I had kept quiet during the whole process, but now it was time to fight back publicly. My lawyer reached out to the publication that had run her story and provided them with the real evidence: the texts, the financial records, everything. They retracted the article almost immediately. The truth was too strong to ignore. And once the real story came out, Jessica's attempt at revenge completely backfired. Instead of gaining sympathy, she was exposed as a liar and a manipulator on a much larger scale than before. And that was the final straw. By the time we got back to court, the judge had no patience left for her antics. Not only did I win the divorce case, but Jessica was left with nothing. The judge ruled that she wasn't entitled to a dime of my earnings. And in fact, she was ordered to pay restitution to the men she had scammed over the years. Her entire financial house of cards came crashing down. Now, here's where it gets even better. Remember those men she had conned? Several of them decided to press charges. Jessica found herself facing multiple lawsuits for fraud and blackmail. She had built her whole life around manipulating people, and now it was all catching up to her. Her legal fees skyrocketed. Her reputation was in tatters, and no one was left in her corner to help her. Even her own family had distanced themselves after everything that came out in court. But that's not all. After the divorce, I went back to living my life, finally free from all the chaos she had caused. I focused on rebuilding my career, reconnecting with friends, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. And you know what? Karma has a funny way of working. A few months after the divorce was finalized, I met someone. It wasn't something I was actively looking for, but it happened naturally. She was kind, supportive, and most importantly, honest. We took things slow, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could trust someone again. Meanwhile, Jessica? She was still drowning in legal battles, trying to claw her way out of the mess she had made. Last I heard, She had moved in with a distant relative and was working a minimum wage job just to make ends meet. Her life was a far cry from the one she had been living when she was juggling men and money. In the end, she lost everything: her reputation, her finances, her relationships, and I walked away with a sense of peace and closure. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy her. Her lies, her manipulation, and her greed were what did her in. She dug her own grave, and all I had to do was let her fall into it. So, if there's one thing you take away from my story, it's this: the truth always comes out. No matter how deep someone tries to bury it, no matter how many lies they tell, eventually it all catches up to them. And when it does, there's no escaping the consequences. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey, guys. I hope my experience serves as a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about letting karma do the work for you. Stay strong, keep your head up, and don't settle for anything less than you deserve.